This is a Dhamma presentation.
Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa Aparutate Sangamatassa Dwara Yesotavanto Pamanchantu Sadhante. Okay, so I'll just feed off some of the ideas that people have mentioned beforehand, but so the topic was raised something about views and attachment to views, and how that's relevant or what kind of effects that has. Now, in Buddhism, we have, of course, the Noble Eightfold Path, which is how to get enlightened. And the first factor on the Noble Eightfold Path is the factor of right view, right? Samadhi. Now, sometimes it's a bit controversial in Buddhism. Some people argue that right view means that you have to have like a correct understanding of things, okay? So that means that there are certain ideas that are wrong and certain ideas that are right, and you have to get rid of the wrong ones and have the right ones. So this is kind of like a dualistic approach. And we find support for that in the suttas, that you should abandon wrong view and then develop right view. Okay? And there are certain things which are wrong view and certain things which are right view. But there's another point of view as well, which is the idea that we should overcome our attachment to views, right? So that it's not about so much about whether your view is right or wrong, but it's more about what is your attitude towards the views, what you're holding on to it. And so that's more of a kind of a non-dual approach, that is sort of going beyond the notion of right and wrong. I don't particularly want to kind of go too much into the technical details of those two particular perspectives, but just to, I think that there's something to both of those ways of looking at it. And as was mentioned in that question about the recent events in France, with another very terrible shooting, death, 12 people killed as a result of views. And we, of course, in Sydney, we just had the events just a month ago or so now, with also people being killed because of views. So what are we to do about this? How are we to relate to it? In religion, we seem to have this funny thing where we take those things in life which are the most difficult to know, right? How was the world created? What is the meaning of life, right? What is the highest good? Right? We take all of those things which are actually pretty uncertain, really, and are quite problematic and difficult things, and we imbue those things with this certainty, this holding on to things. And it almost seems like the more unreal and abstract and impossible something is, that the more dogmatically that we insist on it, the more that we think it must be absolutely true, and the more we find this sense of hatred for anybody who believes a different idea than we do. And if there's anything which is, for me, is like a vision of hell, it would be a world where everybody believed the same thing. Wouldn't that be terrible? My God. Newspaper comes out in the morning, politicians agree on policy. You watch a movie with your friends, it comes to an end, you say, oh, I thought that was pretty good. Yeah, I thought it was pretty good too. What a terrible world to live in that would be, if everybody agreed about everything. Right? And we know that no matter what it is that you talk about, whether it's which cafe has the best cup of coffee, is this coffee better or is that one better, right? Then people are going to disagree about that. What is the best kind of shoe to wear? People will disagree. What's the best song to listen to? People will disagree. Everything, people disagree about it. I live in a monastery with other monks, and we disagree with each other all the time, Even though we're Buddhist monks, we've sort of gone forth. We share so many things in common, right? But we still manage to disagree, usually in a reasonably civilized manner, hardly ever resorting to fisticuffs. No, seriously, hardly ever. But still we disagree about things all the time. So what are we going to do if we imagine that we can't agree with somebody about, what's the best way to drink a cup of coffee, right? We can't agree on, should you read the newspaper from the sports section first or from the front? You can't agree on anything. And yet somehow we can't rest until we have a world where everybody agrees with what I think about the most important and profound questions of life. Right? This is just madness. Absolute madness. And I think it's one of the refreshingly sane and nice things about Buddhism is that Buddhism never imagines that there's going to be a world where everyone is Buddhist. I think it's much better to have a place where people aren't all Buddhists. I've lived in countries where everyone's Buddhist. I lived in Thailand for 6 years. Everyone's kind of Buddhist. At least they tick the box called Buddhism when the census comes around. It's all right. It's a nice country. People are good. But it's not. I much prefer living in a place where people have different ideas, different views, and when you can talk about that, when it's okay. I mean, what kind of fear is there in the mind that says everybody has to believe the same thing that I do, or else there's something wrong? How insecure do you have to be like that? And why is it that we're so insisting everybody has to share our beliefs of God or something like that? We know that not everyone's going to share our beliefs as what's the right soccer team to support. So why should we all believe in the same God? So this is something in Buddhism is, I think, I think it's less of a problem than we find often in the world and often in religious spheres, but it certainly is something that we find. And it's something I've noticed in myself and I've sort of worked with over the years and try to overcome this kind of being too dogmatic or too harsh on people who have a different idea. Actually, I find these days, as as time goes on, I've gone through phases of getting more dogmatic and less dogmatic. These days, I find myself getting more dogmatic as time goes on. I don't know. Maybe I'm just getting curmudgeonly in my old age. But I don't know. Partly it's perhaps to do with I don't know, with feeling that time's running out. Maybe for me, or maybe because of the world with climate change and these threats that we're facing. Feeling that our time. We've got to make a change. We've got to do something, and it's got to be now. So many things that are so unimportant. And so sometimes you can feel that sense of frustration. Yeah. It's not just religious things. I mean, climate change, I think, is a good example. Where you have a very serious and very problematic situation. Right? Our lifestyle is unsustainable. We are rapidly heading towards a situation where it's just not going to work anymore, where we've had consistent and straightforward advice from scientists and policymakers for so many years. And yet it seems to be impossible for us to actually make any meaningful changes. It's always like, next time, at the end of the year, next set of meetings, next something, we'll do something. Meanwhile, we'll just keep on doing exactly what we've been doing the whole time. So there's this kind of twofold thing. On the one hand, I think that everyone should be able to believe whatever you want. You should be able to believe in completely stupid things if you want to. Right? Yeah, it's all right. Believe in whatever. But on the other hand, beliefs really do affect our lives and they affect our choices. So we should do, I think, something to try to shift not just ourselves, but to shift our world in a direction of having some more sane, more wise, more compassionate views. The question is, how do we do that? Usually, blowing stuff up is not a particularly good way of convincing people to have the same views as you. Right? And one of the premises of a liberal society is the premise that if you encourage freedom of speech, freedom of opportunity, encourage education among the people, then on the whole there'll be a kind of movement towards a greater wisdom, a greater understanding, more compassion. And I think that aspect of a liberal society is, I think, very much in line with the Buddhist principles as well. For example, you can see that one of the innovations that the Buddha made in his society was that he didn't restrict the sacred texts to just one group of people, right? So in the Brahmanical tradition, the Vedas, they would keep their sacred scriptures, and it's only the Brahmanical priests who could recite them, right? And so there's this restriction on freedom of speech. And if you were from one of the lower castes, then according to one of the scriptures, you should have like molten lead poured in your ears if you listened to the Vedas. It's a little bit strong, isn't it? Yeah. Not sure whether anybody actually ever did that, all right? I mean, it's not all the time you find something that's written in an ancient scripture. But anyway, even the fact that somebody thought that might be a good idea is already quite worrying, right? So from the Buddhist point of view, the Buddha always says he didn't have the acharya murti, so he didn't have the closed fist of a teacher. He just shared everything. He said, this is the teaching, this is Dhamma. Anybody take it and learn it. And if you look at the way that the Buddha interacted with people, it's always very, very educational, very, very interesting. There are many, many discourses where the Buddha would wander into, say, an ashram, like a community of ascetics from one of the many different religious movements in the time of the Buddha. The Buddha would go in there. And some of them you find, for example, that they'd be sitting around chatting and talking, and they'd see the Buddha coming, and then they'd say, shh, 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 everyone now be quiet. The Buddha's coming. He really respects a nice quiet community, so we'll just sit here and be quiet so the Buddha comes and talks to us. And the Buddha comes up and they all say, welcome, greet him, and so on. And they said to the Buddha, please teach us about what your teaching is. What is your Dhamma? And the Buddha said to them, well, just leave that aside for now. Don't worry about that. Tell me, what's your teaching? Yeah? And they were so amazed. They said, nobody has ever done this before. Every other time we've had a monk or an ascetic come to see us, they always tried to convince us of their teaching. Even if we didn't ask, they'd still tell us right? Even if we weren't interested, they'd still tell us, right? And here comes the Buddha, and we asked him to teach us his teaching, and he said, no, I prefer to listen to your teaching. Yeah? And that, to me, is really the heart of Buddhism and the heart of the Dhamma. So we don't teach Buddhism in order to convert people to become Buddhists. Right view doesn't mean I'm going to go around and force everybody to believe in karma and rebirth. I'm not going to make everyone think that the Noble Eightfold Path is the right way to get enlightened. I'm not going to sort of pass a law saying everything is impermanent. Okay, we can go and lobby Parliament, say you must pass a law saying everything is impermanent. That's not how we do things. Yeah? So the Buddha wasn't interested in that kind of thing. In the Udambarika Sihanada Sutta, the Buddha is talking to a wanderer, and he says, there's a long discussion with him, and he says, look, you might think that I'm teaching you these things in order to make you abandon your former teacher, but do not think so. Let your teacher remain your teacher. You might think that I'm teaching you these things in order to make you abandon your practices, but do not think so. Let your practices remain your practices. Let your beliefs remain your beliefs. Do all the things that you wanted to do. But just the only reason that I'm teaching is to help you to overcome suffering. That's all. Okay? So right view, the purpose of right view is to help us to overcome suffering. Okay? And if your attachment to right view is causing you to suffer, okay, then don't you think that's a sign that maybe there's some work to be done there? Yeah? It doesn't mean that the view's wrong. Okay, maybe you're right. But are we right to get upset because somebody disagrees with us? Are we right to get angry at somebody because they're explaining the Dhamma in a way that we think is wrong? So from a Buddhist point of view, always come back to that. Always come back to what is the letting go of suffering. So the purpose of right view is to lead to the ending of suffering, nothing else. Which is why the essence, the core of right view that the Buddha talked about is the right view of the Four Noble Truths. Truth that there is suffering. Right? If you don't believe that there is suffering, or that you're suffering, then don't even bother. Okay? Just go away and enjoy yourself, right? Have fun and come back and see us when you're ready, okay? There's suffering. Origin of suffering, yeah? It comes from inside yourself. Your own greed, hatred, your own attachment, your conceit, attachment to the idea of a self, all of these things. And it's not to say that there aren't external sources of suffering as well. Of course there are, right? This is obvious. Right? Sometimes we suffer because the weather's too hot. Sometimes you suffer because whatever, acts of terrorism, something like that. People do stupid and terrible things. Sometimes we suffer because you get sick. So, of course, there are all these external sufferings, and it's not to... Buddha's teaching is not meant to dismiss these kinds of suffering, and I think this is important to understand. So, things like, say, social injustice, okay? Social injustice is not a core teaching of the Buddha, right? The Buddha wasn't a social revolutionary, yeah? He was a meditator and a spiritual teacher. So, but that doesn't mean he was indifferent to these kinds of social suffering, okay? So if we can overcome the problems of injustice, inequality, violence in society, all of these things, great. Of course, that's really important. We should all do what we can to do that. But of course, that struggle itself is more suffering, and it's not something that you're ever going to succeed at, right? The world just is how it is. Right? We can make some things a bit better, right? So certain injustices we can maybe help with, certain kinds of inequality we can help with, right? So we can make things a bit better, and we should try, but you're never going to completely fix the world. So when the Buddha is pointing to this second noble truth, he's pointing to what are the deepest forms of suffering. The most important form of suffering, that suffering that we cause inside ourselves. And as long as we have that attachment, that ignorance, that delusion, that greed, that anger, then we're going to keep on coming back, and we're going to keep on giving rise to more and more and more suffering. So that's really the core of the Buddhist message. On the one hand, it's kind of difficult, it's challenging, it's demanding, right? So Buddhism doesn't say that you can just show up to church on Sunday and do a kind of a ritual and then you'll be fine, right? It doesn't sort of allow you sort of absolution from any external force. It says you must find that within yourself. So that's very challenging, but it's also very empowering, okay? Because it's something that we can actually see. It doesn't revolve around any metaphysical beliefs. It doesn't revolve around any dogmas or doctrines or anything like that. But you can see it for yourself. Anybody can sit in meditation for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes and see that letting go. And see that letting go leads to peace. Yeah? So that's very empowering. Because it's not just the first two noble truths, but it's also the noble truth of the ending of suffering. And that's something which is actually quite startling, right? I mean, the normal way that we think about the world, the normal way we go about things is that we expect that there'll be suffering, right? That's how it is. Yeah? You do stuff, and sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's a struggle. There's always those tensions and those. Never perfect. The things we wanted to create, they're never as good as they were in our minds. The ideas that we have, the plans that we have, all of the things we're trying to do in our life, they never work out as well as we wanted. There's always a gap between our wishes and our aspirations and the reality. So that worldly way of thinking about things, you just come to accept that that's how it is, and we can manage it a bit, and we can reduce the suffering a bit, and and then the Buddha comes along and says there is actually an ending to all of that. It's of course what we call Nibbana in Buddhism, right? So to accept the reality of Nibbana is not to accept that there's some kind of, some kind of separate reality. I remember one time we had some Rosicrucians came to the monastery when I was in Perth, and they said, we also believe in Nibbana. They said it's a moon that revolves around Saturn. We're like, I'm not quite sure if it's the same Nibbana that we're talking about. But anyway, so belief in Nibbana doesn't mean you don't have to believe in, that there's some other kind of special thing or anything like that. It's just observing in yourself. When you're attaching to things, when you're getting involved in hatred, and you see the suffering that comes from it. You don't have to be. I don't have to persuade you of that. You just have to look. You see that, and then when you let go of it, you see the peace. So Nibbana, don't think of Nibbana as being some kind of special state or metaphysical entity or anything like that. Nibbana is just the peace that comes when we let go, that's all. That's why it's so profound. And then finally, the last part of the Four Noble Truths is the truth of the path. So the Four Noble Truths: suffering, the origin, the ending, and the path. And so the Buddha said this is all he taught. You can sum up the whole of the Buddha's teachings in 4 words: suffering, origin, ending, path. Do you think you'd be able to remember that from tonight's talk? Yeah? If you don't remember anything else, just remember those 4 words, okay? Suffering, origin, something, there's an origin of suffering, and then there's something else of suffering. Origin. And the path. So the path, of course, we can describe the path in many ways, but the main way the Buddha talked about the path was in terms of the Noble Eightfold Path. Right? And the Eightfold Path consists of right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right samadhi. And think about all of the things that are not part of the Eightfold Path. Right? All the things that are not there. Winning the favour of the gods is not there, for example. Getting a special blessing from an enlightened monk is not there. What else isn't there? Lots and lots of things are not there. What is there are very sensible, sane, common sense practices that everybody in this room can actually do. Right view. Right? We're developing right view just by sitting here, listening to the talk. This is your right view. Right intention. Yeah? To practice letting go and compassion and so on. Right speech. Right action. Yeah? Trying to live a life of harmlessness and honesty and so on. Right livelihood. Yeah? Trying to do a job that at the very least isn't hurting anybody. And if you do a job that actually helps, that's even better. Yeah, right effort, is actually making an effort in meditation to get a regular practice going. Right mindfulness, right samadhi. All of these things follow along from each other. There's nothing mystical about it. There's nothing mysterious. There's nothing particularly difficult. Just requires us to understand and to practice to actually do it. So, if we come back to that question about, do we have this dualistic understanding of right view, right? Is there right view versus wrong view, or do we have this kind of letting go idea that we let go of our attachment to all our views? Well, of course, both of those come into play. So on the one hand, we should have right view, and on the other hand, we should also let go of our attachment to right view. But when we think about the right view in terms of the Four Noble Truths, then it doesn't become so much something that you have to sort of dogmatically insist on, right? So if you're talking with somebody or you have a disagreement with somebody who maybe has an understanding of Buddhism or something that's different from ours or something like that, then don't think of it in terms of right and wrong so much, but you think of it in terms of Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths is about where are your attachments leading to suffering. And if somebody's sort of insisting on some particular view or some particular idea or something like that, then usually it's because inside them there's some kind of suffering, right? So this is we even think of the terrorist act in France we had just recently. Yeah, the people who did that, there's a lot of suffering in there. So to say that isn't to excuse it in any way or to offer any kind of justification for it or whatever. We're all suffering, and we don't all go and do such stupid things. But once you understand that the people, even those people we might disagree with so profoundly, once we understand that they too are suffering, then we can see that I also am suffering. I also have that stupidity. I also have that hatred. And so there's the beginnings of the capacity to make some connection. And that's where the roots of compassion come from. And if we're ever to get beyond this kind of silliness, this kind of destructive fundamentalism which our world has seemingly sunk further into in the last couple of decades, if we're ever to get beyond that, it's not going to come by insisting that everyone has the same beliefs that we have. It's not going to come by persuading everybody to become a Buddhist. Right? It's going to come from a compassion and from understanding. It's going to come from an acceptance that there are different ways of seeing things. It's going to come from a greater understanding of what's really important. The suffering that we all feel. And that wish to be able to, for ourselves and for others, to be able to overcome that suffering. This is what we mean by compassion in Buddhism. Compassion isn't just a feeling, but compassion is something which should propel us into action. If we can address things at that kind of level, growing the wisdom and the compassion in the world, we're not going to stop terrible things from happening. We're not going to stop people from being stupid and violent and hateful and murderous. But what we can do is start planting those seeds and start growing those qualities, which hopefully can, little bit by little bit, can lessen those things. They can make the world a bit of a wiser place, a bit of a more compassionate place. Okay, so that's probably enough for now. So that's my talk for this evening on right view and compassion and how to relate to those things. So I offer that for your reflection. And I'd like to invite if anyone has any comments or questions or good jokes.